Previously on Starseed Psyche, Kyo Adachi is an angry young man who hates most aspects of his life and world, and often points his anger at anyone who ever has anything nice to say about the alien race that has come to visit Earth in the last few years, called the Kyuserax. They've long asserted that they've come to Earth to help humanity, but an attack on Kyo's home city of Tokyo, undertaken by alien technology near identical to that of the Kyuserax, makes it hard to believe that. After being briefly saved during this attack by a young woman in advanced military tech, Kyo is still killed anyway and meets his spirit guide, Yorick. Yorick tells Kyo that his dad's last words to him when he was a kid were meant to help inspire him to keep working at trying to become a dancer, regardless of whatever anyone else said. But he'd long since given up on that passion, and as a result gotten very off track from his best life and best self. Yorick tells Kyo that he needs to return to Earth and shape up his life and become a much mentally and physically healthier person, because in 333 days he is going to shake hands with both the love of his life and his greatest rival on the same day. They'll be very important figures in him living his best life going forward, but if he's still a grouch living a life he hates by then, they'll both pass him by. Yorick returns Kyo to his body, where he wakes up determined to become his best self as quickly as he can, to be ready for that fateful day. Now please enjoy today's chapters of Starseed Psyche, and if you're new to the channel and are enjoying what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe for more chapters and plenty of other stories. Despite everything that had happened, I actually managed to fall back asleep in the hospital bed until early the next morning. When I awoke once more, the doctors were shocked. I'd been out for over 24 hours, and everyone who saw me in the hospital was baffled that I'd woken up at all, let alone that I seemed to be totally fine, besides a few scrapes and bruises. The doctors said I should have brain damage given the blow to the head I took, but I was showing no signs. They probably would have run more tests if the hospital wasn't overwhelmed with patients after the attack. They sent my mom and me away pretty quickly to focus on people at death's door. My mom was really happy to see me okay and wanted me to come to her place to recover further, but I told her I was fine. I had been a little bitter when I'd woken up, having just seen the memory of her and a lot of other people telling me that dancing was a waste of time, but seeing her in tears over me being okay got rid of that bitterness pretty quickly. I knew it couldn't have been easy for her raising me on a pretty minuscule salary after my dad died. She was always scared of money running out, so if I was in her shoes, I probably would have tried to talk my kid out of a really risky career path too. I went to get breakfast with her, but didn't mention anything about my little trip to wherever I'd just been chatting with Yorick. I assumed she'd think I was crazy and did have brain damage if I tried to explain. Later that day, I was kinda surprised to see that I was actually able to get home. The city was an absolute mess, and a lot of buildings around mine had been badly damaged or even totally destroyed, but mine was fine. I wanted to avoid watching or listening to anything that would get me angry because it seemed pretty evident that my anger was one of the main things I needed to fix in the next 333 days. But I also needed to know what the heck had happened with that alien invasion. I watched and read a few different pieces of news, and despite it having happened only about 24 hours ago, there seemed to be a pretty consistent narrative around the events. The news was saying that the same cities the Kyuserax had first publicly visited were the ones that were attacked. New York, Cairo, Mumbai, Sydney, Shanghai, and, of course, here in Tokyo. I couldn't find much actual footage of them, but apparently the Kyuserax were adamantly denying any involvement in the attacks, despite the tech being pretty obviously their own. The news had dubbed the mechanical Kyuserax-like beings that undertook the attack the Kyuserax, and apparently there was a bigger variety of them than what I'd seen. They were completely mechanical, and within minutes of being destroyed beyond use, they'd start to deteriorate from the inside out, so the tech couldn't be well studied. The attacks had each lasted exactly an hour, then stopped out of nowhere, with the invading vessels all retreating and disappearing into space. Some Kyuserax leaders had been taken into custody, and the rest of their ships not involved in the attacks had been forced off-world at gun, missile, and tank point. They'd vacated the planet, but many were still flying in the outer atmosphere. The news was assuring us that another attack was soon to come, though we had no idea when or why. They did provide some hope though, in the form of footage from a prototype military program based right here in Japan called Suberaith. I got really excited when I saw the squadron being referred to because I instantly recognized the tech worn by these Japanese soldiers. I also recognized the girl in the middle of their team shot. She was the one who'd fought off the Kyuserax before I died. This Suberaith Squadron were all clad in the same sort of suit she had worn, except they had different types of blades on their arms. One guy even had them on his legs. There was a surprising amount of footage of them fighting the Kyuserax, and they were absolutely tearing through them with this tech, though none more so than Yamada Toshiko. She saved a lot more people than just me that night. I watched completely in awe of her movements. She looked like a hero right out of a manga. Various cell phone and news footage of her showed Toshiko sprinting along the sides of buildings, carving through Kyuserax drones, saving people from falling rubble, and even managing to sprint up a wall to damage the hull of a low-flying Kyuserax ship. She was incredibly agile, but what struck me was that her movements almost had a dance-like quality to them. That got an idea churning in my head, but I needed more of a prompt to start considering it as possible. I kept reading more into this Suberaith program, and learned that Toshiko was second in command of the squad, just after Yamada Ritsu. This was her mother, though it was quickly clear Toshiko hadn't gotten the position because of her mom. Toshiko was being lauded as the creator of the tech they were using. It had been developed in case of Kyusidian attack, and was made to be able to carve through even the incredibly durable material of Kyusidian ships. Toshiko's father was a former, now deceased, American military general, and her mother had been a lieutenant general in the Japanese army until being prompted to lead this new program. General Yamada Ritsu seemed to be the only person over the age of 30 wearing the Suberaith tech. The reason for this was quickly revealed. For the tech to function properly without harming the user, they needed to have a biological age of 28 or younger. I didn't know what that meant, but luckily they went on to explain that your chronological age is what we normally think of when we talk about our age, but biological age is the age of your cells. If you're really healthy and exercise and eat well, then your biological age could be a lot lower than your chronological age. General Yamada Ritsu was an anomaly. She was 62 years old, but she was so dedicated to her health and fitness that her biological age was 22. I knew I had to be the opposite. I was only 24, but given my health at the time, I figured my biological age was probably a lot older than that. The next thing I learned was that, with the Kyuserax having attacked many countries, the Japanese army was working with other militaries around the world to sell and share this tech, and was actively scouting able-bodied recruits to use it. There would be recruitment tryouts starting in 1 week, then another round in 6 months. This sounded really cool to me, but given everything I'd just experienced with Yorick and had to get down to work on, I didn't initially plan on pursuing it. That is until one very important piece of footage flashed before me. It was a quick shot as they talked about sharing resources with the American military, which Toshiko had familial connections to. It was her initiating a handshake with an American command sergeant major. That might seem like a silly thing to grab me, but you've got to keep in mind that it was really rare for me to shake hands with anyone. The only time I ever did was on the odd occasion I met a foreigner, since here in Japan, bowing is our main formal greeting. Yorick said that 333 days after I returned, I'd shake 2 people's hands, the love of my life and my greatest rival. That was when I started putting a theory together. I had no idea how valid it was, but I couldn't help feeling there was some truth to it. Maybe Yorick hadn't just wanted to talk to me that night, maybe Yorick had led me to a spot where I'd see Yamada Toshiko to get a glimpse of who the love of my life was. Maybe I was supposed to be good at dancing by now because the agility and stamina I'd gain from that would make me able to join the Suberaith program. Helping save the world from alien invaders did sound like something that would be pretty sweet to have as part of my ideal life. I checked the time. It was 1:11 in the afternoon. There was still plenty of day left for me to get started building towards a Suberaith Squad ready body, but something else dawned on me in that moment. Because I'd been out for a full day, it was now Monday. That was when I realized I hadn't called into my job to tell them I wouldn't be there. You'd think a couple days after our city was attacked by aliens, we'd all have the day off. But you'd be wrong. A surprising amount of people were going about their day as if nothing had happened. It was like being surrounded by zombies. When I got to the office, my boss wasn't overtly angry, but he did say, "Adachi, you're alive. So why are you so late?" That made it a bit easier for me to give my 2 weeks notice. I was still terrified about having enough money to keep myself going, given I probably needed to pay up to join a gym and dance classes, but if I was all in on what Yorick had said, I needed to be really all in. I'd never wanted anything more than that life Yorick had let me have a taste of. Plus, the more I thought about Yamada Toshiko, the more excited I got about my theory that she was the one I needed to shake hands with. My boss was very dismissive when I quit, and surprisingly just told me to pack up my desk and go. I wouldn't even have to stay for the 2 weeks. They'd even still pay me for those 2 weeks. I couldn't understand why, but I wasn't about to argue, so I did as he said, not even taking a moment to say goodbye to my coworkers. I'd never got to know any of them very well. I'd worked in a low-level accounting job at that company since getting out of school, and had hated pretty much every second of it. Despite my money fears, I couldn't help feeling a massive wave of relief and disbelief that I'd never have to work that job again. Unfortunately, with the transit back to my apartment being so much longer than usual, thanks to the destroyed buildings and streets, I found myself bored and instinctively pulling up my phone to go to the Q Saviors page. By the time I got there and was opening up the latest post that read, "It wasn't them," I realized how mindlessly I sought out stuff that made me mad. I knew all I'd get from going to his page was being ticked off, so why had I done it? I called myself an idiot and shoved my phone back in my pocket. The rest of the way home, I still found myself wanting to go to his page and listen to the nonsense he had to say about the attacks, but I kept stopping myself. His page would have made me angry, but I ended up just getting angry at myself for wanting to go to his page so badly. I tried just telling my brain to shut up and be happy, but within seconds it'd just be spiraling again. It was infuriating. To distract myself, I decided to see if I could find anything to help with my anger. I looked up, "Why am I so angry all the time?" on a whim, and surprisingly, there was a book called Why Am I So Angry All the Time? I read the summary, and it was by a British-born author named Arjun Angelo. It was written very informally, and that really resonated with me. I was sure there were some very proper psychology books that could have helped, but I really wanted to hear from someone who was just some guy like me that managed to fix his anger problems. This bio was exactly what I wanted. It read like it had been made just for me. It said, "My name is Argent Angelo, and I used to be such a furious grouch of a man that I gave myself a heart attack yelling at a coworker at 27 years old. I knew I needed to fix myself or I was going to die young, so I tried everything from talk therapy to hypnosis to meditation to extreme sports. 7 years later, things that used to send me spiraling now only cling to me for a few minutes at most. In this book, I lay out what worked and what didn't, so that, hopefully, it doesn't take you 7 years to get the same results." I immediately went to a site to buy the book. The ebook was way cheaper than the audiobook, but I also knew I'd get through it a lot faster if I could listen to it while exercising and stuff. I felt my money anxiety rising up again. I started thinking about if I was being too stingy or if I was being smart. Yorick had dissed me for my ability to handle money, but had also promised to take care of my money issues for a while. Maybe this was a lesson in trust. But what if it wasn't? The confusion was just another thing making me mad. I was about to put my phone away and just not bother buying the book at all, but I accidentally hit the back button and returned to my search for the book. A sale caught my eye. Another site had the audiobook for less, but barely. What grabbed me about it wasn't the sale itself, but the specific discount. It was 111 yen off. That was practically nothing, but I realized I'd seen that number a bunch of times since waking up. I wondered if that was one of the numbers Yorick had mentioned as being a way spirit guides communicate with people. I looked up, what does 111 mean? Not sure if I'd get any results, but sure enough, I was prompted to read information on something called angel numbers. Numbers like 111, 222, 333, and so on were apparently believed by some to be messages from higher beings, all with different meanings. 111 was generally believed to be encouragement to follow your intuition and was associated with confidence and independence. I didn't really know if I was any good at following my intuition, but it seemed like it had been telling me to get that audiobook. Maybe seeing this number was encouragement from Yorick. I also got excited realizing that when I'd seen it earlier that day, I was pretty sure, at that moment, I'd been creating my theory about Yamada Toshiko. I was still concerned about spending money, but thought to myself, remember Kyo, you're all in on getting that beautiful life. I went to the site with the sale and bought the book. I had to admit, it had felt good. I really was all in. I got home with more determination than I ever remember having, knowing that I needed to get down to work. I may have had 333 days until I shook hands with the love of my life, but if there was any chance I was right about it being Yamada Toshiko, I'd need to be fit enough in 6 months to go to the Suberaith Squad recruitment tryouts. I looked up the program again. Because of the specific biological age bracket you needed to be in to apply, they had open calls for any able-bodied people to try out. It also said that the training after recruits were accepted would be 4 months. That would mean if I got in, by the time I graduated to be part of a squad, it would be almost perfect timing for the day of the handshakes. It scared me to shrink my timeline down for getting physically fit, but I also saw that the training the accepted recruits went through was more intense than anything I could do on my own. It would be sure to rush me through my progress even faster to becoming my best self. I needed to get into this program. I had Argent's book to help get my mind out of its anger loops, so the next step was my fitness and dance skills. I signed up for both weekly dance classes and a gym membership. I cringed as I registered for a beginner dance class, given I'd gotten so much better than that when I was younger, but knew I was too out of practice to jump into something tougher. I also cringed thinking about what Kentaro and Minoru would say about me signing up for ballet class. When we were kids, they'd ripped into me about it a lot. It ticked me off thinking about how their discouragement had eventually been one of the things that made me stop. But I also remembered I hadn't checked on them yet to see if they were both okay after the attacks. They didn't live in Shibuya, where the main attacks had happened, but I still wanted to make sure they were okay. It concerned me that I hadn't woken up to any texts from them. I fired off a message to both of them, then got back to planning how my next year needed to go. Ballet wasn't the only type of dance I liked doing, but I knew it would be the best way to get back in form. Contemporary dance classes would help me with every other type of dance. Pairing that with going to the gym seemed like the best way to get the physique Yorick had shown me. At least until Suberaith training could take over my own exercise routine. Unfortunately, going to the gym was going to be really out of my element. I'd gone maybe 4 times in my life and never felt like I knew what I was doing. Still, I was all in. My first dance class wouldn't be for a few days, but I could go to the gym right away, so I headed off. It was pretty empty that day, and I was happy about that. I didn't want a bunch of buff dudes watching me fail as I tried to figure out what I was doing. There were a few people on treadmills facing away from the weights, and some people in slightly above average shape using some of the dumbbells. However, there was one guy who would have been hard to miss, and just looking at him made me embarrassed for my own fitness. He was probably 6'4" and seemed almost as wide. He looked like he was from India or the Middle East and was doing reps on the bench press with more weight than I figured I could roll across the ground. He jumped up after a set looking amped up and bouncing on his toes. He looked at me and gave a friendly nod. I sort of nodded, but also looked away, though something very important about him caught my eyes. He had massive shoulders. They were like a bigger version of the ones on my ideal self. There was no way I'd ask him for advice, though. I was sure he was judging a schlubby guy like me for being at the gym at all. I put in my headphones, started listening to my book, and pulled up some images of common shoulder workouts. I grabbed weights that I thought would be right for me and found they were way too heavy. Looking at the smaller sizes, I realized I was going to have to grab something like the 10-pound dumbbells. I was embarrassed even eyeing them. They looked like the weights a toddler would use. Meanwhile, the Indian Juggernaut guy was benching more than twice my body weight. I tried splitting the difference, taking 15 pounds, but was barely getting 3 reps out of them. I also realized I was barely paying attention to my book. Then I found myself getting angry from the combination of missing things in the book that was meant to help me not be angry, and not being able to lift the weight I wanted. I did my best that day, but felt like I looked ridiculous the whole time. When I left the gym, I was frustrated, and eventually got replies from Kentaro and Minoru that also made me mad. They both said they were fine, which made me wonder why they hadn't checked on me since I lived in the ward that had been attacked. They also both sent me posts from Q Saviors telling me to look at how stupid the guy was. That just made me even more angry. I was trying to not go looking for stuff like that. I felt weird trying to tell them that though, so I just pretended I'd gone to see the posts. For the next hour, my mind kept spiraling on everything I could possibly be angry or anxious about. I would basically switch from being mad about some random thing that popped into my head to noticing that I was dwelling on garbage and getting mad at myself for not having more control. In desperation to try and get out of this anger loop, I threw on a chapter of Argent's book, and thankfully was immediately struck with one of the most useful pieces of advice I'd ever heard. It was perfect enough that I wouldn't have been surprised to hear that Yorick had somehow lined it up for me. Once you've decided that you're going to become a less angry person, you are going to become much more consciously aware of all the countless times you do get angry in a day. You'll likely do exactly what I did, get mad at yourself, and even call yourself a moron for not being able to stop. But this is exactly the opposite approach you need to take. You must understand that every time you catch yourself, that is a victory. If you get angry at yourself for being angry, you're simply reinforcing the problem. When you catch yourself and stop, no matter how briefly, celebrate it. Tell yourself, yes, good on me, I caught myself again. This will not only give you positive reinforcement to continue catching yourself, but it will also actively put you in a better mood for feeling good about the achievement. Then, you're less likely to quickly slip back into ruminating on anger or whatever other negative thoughts you were dwelling on. I paused so completely while listening to that I even briefly stopped breathing. That advice seemed so obvious after hearing it. Getting angry at myself for being angry was totally counterproductive. I immediately wrote that down as a note in my phone, screenshot it, and made it my background so that every time I opened my phone, I was reminded to keep that in mind. I was not going to let myself forget that advice. My first dance class a couple days later went about as well as my first gym workout, but I stuck with it, and every time I got irritated, I adapted Argent's advice. I tried to think things like, good on me for being here even though it feels really embarrassing. My balance had become absolutely terrible, but I did at least see that some of the moves were coming back to me quickly. I tried to focus on that. In my first 3 weeks after the incident, I did manage to build a routine for myself, and just kept quiet to everyone in my life about the fact that I'd quit my job. I didn't really know how to explain what I was doing. There were no more Kyuserax attacks in that period, but every time I turned on the news, they were always talking about some new evidence that suggested the next attack was imminent, though their reasons seemed different every time. It was really confusing, so I just tried to listen to as much as I needed to stay informed, then turn it off and focus on getting mentally and physically in shape. I'd occasionally look up info on how the first round of recruits for the Suberaith program were doing. Thankfully, they had a very active government-run social media page showing people how cool the training they got to do was. It made me nervous seeing how fit all the recruits were, but I tried to reframe those nerves into inspiration to keep working. I did game with Kentaro and Minoru a few times, but it felt different ever since I started trying to be less angry. I started to notice just how much of every conversation with them revolved around us bonding over complaining. I tried steering the conversation away from that, but they'd pretty quickly get us back into it. As I was realizing how drained I felt every time I hung out with them, I got to another part of Argent's book where he explained, "The most important thing I've learned about anger is that I was angry because I was subconsciously practicing being angry all the time. I would read things that made me angry, work a job that made me angry, and hang out with people who encouraged me to be angry. A doctor informed me while I was on my journey that the more you unconsciously practice being angry by surrounding yourself with an external life that makes you so, the more you wire the synapses in your brain to be naturally more angry even when there's nothing to be angry about. The stronger the synaptic connections made by repeating a task or emotional state, the more naturally it becomes your default. Luckily, you can start wiring those synapses for the better now that you know you want to. It may take time, but it is very doable." He went on to say that if you've got supportive people around you, they might be excited about wanting to learn and grow with you. But if not, you may need to find people that are also trying to make their lives better. The idea of abandoning the friends I'd had since I was a kid seemed horrible, but I did also wonder what it would be like to hang out with someone who actually inspired me. Weirdly, the first person to pop into my head was that Jack dude at the gym. He'd been there almost every time I'd gone, and he always had a big smile on his face no matter how hard he was working. He certainly seemed a lot more upbeat than Kentaro and Minoru. As I thought more about him, I sighed. Out loud, alone in my apartment, I said, I have to go try talking to that guy, don't I? I looked over at the clock. It was 5:55. I looked up that angel number and it was associated with change. I got the message pretty clearly. It was time to try changing my friends. The next day at the gym, it took me about half an hour to psych myself up to go chat with the guy. Every time I looked over, he was either mid-lift or was talking to the staff or other gym goers. Finally, I caught a moment where he was alone and between sets. I nervously walked over. Hey, excuse me? He looked up with a massive smile, as if I was an old friend. He stood up and stuck out a hand. That gave me a little jump scare, but I quickly remembered it was way off from the date of my 2 important handshakes. He quickly pulled back his hand and bowed instead. Right, sorry about that. You'd think I'd be used to the whole bowing thing by now. Anyway, I was wondering if we'd ever chat. Seen you coming in, but I don't like to interrupt folks with headphones in. Name's Chip and Salakali, but you can call me Chip. I realized I'd never heard him speak through my headphones and was completely caught off guard by his American Southern accent. It was not at all what I pictured from a guy that looked like him. I also wasn't used to someone giving me a nickname to call them so quickly, but I went with it. Hey, Chip, Adachi Kyo. You can call me Kyo, I guess. I don't want to bother you, but I really want to get my shoulders bigger, and honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing. Your shoulders are like crazy, so could you give me any tips? His eyes lit up like I'd just told him he won a car. I would be honored. You seem like you come in a lot of the same hours I do, so anytime you want any tips, feel free to come ask. Though, if all goes well, I'm only going to be coming in for another 5 months or so. I felt like I knew the answer already, but excitedly asked, Really? Why 5 months? He stuck a thumb to his chest. I'm going to join the Suberaith Squadron program to help protect Japan against the Kyuserax. I may have only been in Japan for 4 years now, but this here is my home, and I ain't gonna let no invaders lay another finger on it. Plus, that training they get to do looks like it's some fiercely good exercise. Oh wow, that's awesome. I paused, suddenly feeling embarrassed to think I could get into the Suberaith program when I'd be competing with someone as jacked as Chip, but continued anyway. I know I don't have much of a shot, but I want to try out too. That's why I've been coming in. I almost lost my life in the first attack, and I know I probably don't have enough time to get my biological age to the right spot, but I want to try. I know someone like you is way more likely to get in than... He suddenly clapped his hands onto my shoulders with a look of immense determination. You stop that negative self-talk right this instant. I've seen you come in consistently for 3 weeks and do your best, so you already have a dedication that many people fail to maintain. Kyo Adachi, I will do everything in my power to get you in peak physical condition so we can both get into the Suberaith program. I was a weird mix of inspired and intimidated. Thank you, but why? You don't even know me. He whipped out his phone and opened an image folder called Motivation and showed me a picture of a scrawny Indian kid, and it took me a second to recognize the face as Chip's. This was me before I moved to Japan. When I decided to get in shape, all my friends I had back home thought that I was too good for them and stopped wanting to hang out with me. So I started a new life and moved here. But I don't got a lot of friends here yet. Kinda only got the language down this year. But you remind me of me back when I was starting out, so if I can help you progress faster than I did, then it is my duty and privilege to help you. And if I make my first friend here in the process, then that sounds pretty good too. His words seemed pretty similar to Arjun's bio from the Anger book. He wanted to help other people fix their lives faster than he'd been able to. It seemed like a theme of people who went through their own dramatic life changes, and it did get me pretty pumped up to work with Chip. Okay, well, I appreciate it, Chip, so, what do we do first? Chip spent the next 2 hours walking me through better form for all the exercises I'd been doing, and giving me advice on which ones he thought were best. He was also apparently a nutritionist, which was great because I had never paid much attention in food education class. He even offered to take me to the grocery store and plan out a whole new diet. I even got comfortable enough quickly to mention the dance classes I was taking, and he didn't say a single condescending thing about it, like Kentaro and Minoru had so many times before. He even asked if they had any open classes so he could try it. Exercise and physical fitness are the most beautiful aspects of life as a human, and I want to try every single kind imaginable before I die. I've never tried dance, and that is why I must. Chip was so encouraging, fun, and helpful that I was honestly kicking myself a bit for not going to talk to him sooner. Though, in line with my new practice, I instead reframed that to thank myself for having gone to talk to him at all. I was astounded that he hadn't made it into the first round of Suberaith tryouts, but it turned out he hadn't actually gone. He said he'd been hesitant at first and wanted to know more about the program before signing up. After a couple weeks of watching their social media pages and seeing their training regimen, he got hooked on the idea and was all in. Plus, all the news assuring people another attack was imminent got him amped up enough to be certain he had to go for it. That first day after hanging out with Chip, I felt more energized than I had since Yorick had given me those feelings of who I was supposed to be. I almost thought for a second Chip could even be my rival. Though I wouldn't have pictured my greatest rival being someone so smiley and chipper, and I certainly wouldn't try to force a handshake with him when the day came. 2 months in, I was so energized by hanging with Chip and seeing my progress that I rarely even thought about my dwindling funds. I started getting a bit anxious as my bank account approached zero, but in that moment I literally turned my head up and asked for reassurance that Yorick was still looking out for me money-wise. Sure enough, I checked my phone and it was 4:25, which I was pretty sure didn't mean anything, but I had paused my audiobook unknowingly with 3 minutes and 33 seconds left in my current chapter. 333 was the angel number for support, so I tried to take that as the sign I was looking for. Luckily, as promised by Yorick, a couple days later, when I really needed it, the money came in. My grandpa on my dad's side was a pretty well-off man, but had been very stingy for as long as I'd known him. He'd also been very distant since my dad died, but had some spontaneous big change of heart, prompted by a pretty unpleasant event. He had a stroke and was okay afterwards, but my mom and I went to visit him in the hospital to find him in a totally different headspace than usual. He said he realized that he didn't have that many years left in him, and there was no point dying with so much money in the bank. He decided to give a bunch of his inheritance money out to family members now instead of after he passed. He gave some to both me and my mom. What I got was more than enough to keep me going on my current spending habits for at least a year. If everything went as planned, I'd be in the Suberaith program earning a salary from them before the money ran out. I didn't really understand how, but Yorick had indeed come through. With my money problems handled, I had one less concerning thing on my mind as I continued my mental and physical training. Over the rest of those 6 months after the incident, I got to watch my body completely transform. It wasn't always easy to psych myself up for more workouts, but with Chip cheering me on and working out alongside me, it made everything a little bit easier. Chip seemed even more excited about my progress than I did. I gamed a few more times with Kentaro and Minoru, but hangouts were getting more and more sparse. Eventually, I noticed they weren't really asking to hang out anymore anyway. They always wanted to gripe about stuff, and I didn't, so we didn't have much to talk about. As Argent said in his book specifically about being around angry people, "Misery loves company, so when you stop being miserable, if you had miserable friends, they probably won't love your company anymore." I felt a bit like a traitor for not wanting to hang out with them, but it was hard to ignore how polar opposite I felt hanging with Chip instead of them. That ended up becoming my new gauge for who I hung out with going forward. If, after I hung out with someone, I felt inspired or energized or at least relaxed and happy, then they were the kind of person I wanted in my life. If I left a hangout feeling drained and exhausted and angry, that person was not going to join my regular hangout roster. My anger definitely wasn't gone, but the more time I spent hanging with Chip, listening to and reading books like Argent's, and regaining my dance skills, the less often they'd come up. The anger spurts were still more frequent than I'd have liked, but whenever I caught myself getting stuck on them, I'd continue the pattern of appreciating myself for noticing and stopping them. I found Kyuserax news was a bit of a trigger for me. In that time, there were more Kyuserax attacks, but no more in Tokyo, and the reason for them still seemed pretty uncertain, though a few of them did occur on weapons manufacturing sites and industrial farms, furthering theories that they were trying to make us dependent on the Kyuserax. Luckily, anytime there were attacks in Japan, the first round of recruited Suberaith Squadrons were sent in to take them down and were doing an incredible job. The squads were really being glamorized, which made me nervous about more people trying out for the next round, increasing my competition. But even before the tryouts, there was one more thing I needed to do. A couple days before the official tryout day, Chip and I had to go to the Suberaith training center to get our biological ages tested. In that sickly white waiting room, I found I was truly terrified. My body was nearly unrecognizable from what it had been 6 months prior, but it still wasn't up to the level of what Yorick had shown me. Would eating healthy and exercising for 6 months really be enough to get me where I needed to be? Chip and I got blood and saliva taken by the doctors and waited for the longest 15 minutes of my life. The doctor came out and my heart started thudding even harder than it already was, but he just pulled Chip aside. They had a short conversation and Chip gave a massive deep bow to the doctor, then spun around with an even bigger grin than usual. I smiled anxiously back. Under 28, obviously? He nodded. 25, we're in. I smirked. Well, at least you are. Sorry, I am really happy for you. I never doubted you'd get in. He clapped a hand down on my shoulder. You're getting in too, Kyo, and if you don't meet the marker, I'm staying behind with you to train until the next round of tryouts. I stood up. What? No, you can't do that. I'm not making you wait another 6 months. You're right, you're not, but I will make myself wait. You're the first training buddy who's ever stuck with me, so I'm in this with you, or I'm not in this at all. I felt my eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't stop myself from stepping up to the chipper Juggernaut and giving him the biggest hug I could. He hugged me back. Ahem. A doctor interrupted. I let the big guy go and stepped aside with the doctor. The seconds between seeing him and hearing the words leave his mouth felt like an eternity. But as soon as he said the number, I literally dropped to my knees and threw my arms up in the air. Yes! The doctor was not impressed, but Chip darted over. What is it? You got in? 28? I leapt up. Even better, 27! In a booming voice, ignoring the irritated doctor and other waiting guests, Chip yelled, Ooh, 27! Suberaith Squad, get ready for Chip and Kyo! He held up a hand and I slapped mine as hard as I could against it. We marched out of that office with our heads as high as possible. On our way out, I couldn't help but notice the time was 3:33. I wasn't sure if I interpreted it as intended, but I knew that with Chip by my side, I felt supported in a way I hadn't by any other friend before. Thanks to him, and some help from Yorick on the other side, I was one step closer to being the best version of myself, and hopefully, to that fateful handshake with Yamada Toshiko. One of the main reasons I rebooted Starseed Psyche from my pilot a year ago instead of just continuing from there is because I really wanted to add Chip into this series. I think he's going to be a fun character to have around and I got some cool stuff planned for him. But anyway, if you are new to this channel and you want more stories like this, I'll link a playlist of what I consider to be the best episodes to start with on this channel that are either one-off episodes or are the first episodes of ongoing series. Like my series Vigilance, which I have gotten the proof copy of the book version. I still have some work to do to fix a few things, but I will be announcing the pre-orders very soon, and it'll just be on pre-order for like 1 week and then it'll officially be released. So that's coming down the pipe very soon. I'll keep you all updated. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is just a quote I read on Instagram this week, from a page called The Power of Positivity, which said, "You often feel tired not because you've done too much, but because you've done too little that sparks a light in you." I mean, I can relate to that on the level that I've worked a job in the past where I was working 8 hours a day and felt like I was getting burnt out from it. But then there have been times on this channel where I'll be working 12 hours a day for a while and don't feel like I'm getting burnt out because I'm just really energized by what I'm doing. Something worth thinking about, so I hope that's inspiring. I love you all and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday. Mytholethal's second last episode and a community redraw. I'll see you there. Goodbye.